Georgiana Spencer, the Duchess of Devonshire, was as famous in her own time as her descendant, Princess Diana, would be in hers. And the two women had many other things in common. Both were fashion icons, both deeply loved their children, both were very much in the public eye, and both would be caught in a difficult love triangle. While on the surface Georgiana would seem to have it all, under the surface she was beset with addiction, crippling self-doubt and anxiety, and a desperate need to be loved. Georgiana came into the world on the 7th of June 1757 at her family's home at Althorpe, outside Northampton. She was the eldest child of John Spencer, later to become Earl Spencer, and his wife Margaret Georgiana Poyntz. The bond her mother had to her first child was instant, and although Lady Spencer would go on to have 4 more children, she would always openly claim Georgiana was her favourite. 2 of those further children would survive infancy, Georgiana's younger brother George and her younger sister Henrietta. This deep connection between Georgiana and her mother would remain throughout the years, but she and her siblings were all somewhat afraid of their father, who famously had a violent temper. Georgiana's early years would have involved travelling with her family between their fashionable residences. During the social season, they lived in a draughty house on Grosvenor Street in London, and when this became too much, they went to a villa on the outskirts of London at Wimbledon Park. This was followed by a move to their hunting lodge near Kettering in the autumn, and finally back to Althorpe for the winter. But when she was about 7 years old, the family's London base was moved to a newly built mansion in St James's, which had taken the length of Georgiana's life so far to build, and had cost £50,000. Her father John was in possession of one of England's largest fortunes, which he had inherited at just 11 years old on the death of his father. Both Lord and Lady Spencer were a little modern in their thinking when it came to raising children, leaning on ideas from John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Little Georgiana, alongside her siblings, spent time in their classroom learning harp playing, singing and dancing, to geography and various languages, as well as reading and writing. The result was a smart girl who would grow into an accomplished young adult, but her mother was especially happy at how quickly Georgiana seemed to pick up court etiquette. The problem was that her mother made such a fuss about this and praised her daughter profusely. Georgiana's natural personality was eager to please, and she thrived on attention, to the extent that this exacerbated those traits, leaving Georgiana anxious to always be the centre of attention and pleasing everyone. But as idyllic and lavish as this sounds, it wasn't without problems, and it was family ties where Georgiana's issues would start. In 1763, Britain's war with France finally came to an end, and the nobility could once again risk crossing the Channel into Europe. John suffered with his lungs, and he would embark on a grand tour to Italy. Margaret would stay by his side despite her children, and she went with him, leaving her children behind in Britain with very little to grow an affection for one another. Margaret would later write, after leaving her own mother in charge of childcare, that she was leaving her children behind with some difficulty, but that ultimately being a wife came first. Georgiana's 2 youngest siblings were born in 1765 and 1769 respectively, and both died in infancy, leaving the entire family shaken. John and Margaret found themselves grieving deeply, and this would lead to various attempts to numb that pain. Both parents turned to gambling, but for Margaret it became a severe crutch. She would attempt to balance things by doing religious activities, but everyone knew it wasn't genuine. But Georgiana would grow up with a household pattern of gambling, always hovering in the background, and this would affect her in later life. But it wouldn't be long before Georgiana would move from childhood to adulthood at the age of just 16. People had speculated for a few years by that point on her future marriage, as she was quite a catch. Georgiana came from an extremely wealthy family. She was graceful and well-versed in etiquette while maintaining an easy, natural cheeriness to her personality, just educated enough, and was already fast becoming fashionable. It was around this time that on one of the family's jaunts to Spa in Belgium, they bumped into the then 24-year-old Duke of Devonshire, William Cavendish. William Cavendish was also a good catch in his own way, but he was a very different person to Georgiana. He had lost his mother at the age of 6, and his father had been a distant alcoholic. On top of this, William was reserved, quiet, and showed little to no emotion, but was also intelligent and well educated. But the Dukes of Devonshire had been involved heavily in politics and the monarchy since Henry VIII and were part of the fabric of England, as well as being far more wealthy than the Spencers. While no one thought William was a particularly bad person, they were also bemused at the fact he didn't like dancing or social occasions, and some went so far as to describe him as boring. Georgiana mistook William's withdrawn nature to be like her father's. John Spencer was also introverted and quiet, but in private with loved ones he was openly affectionate and passionate. She assumed William was the same underneath his dour expressions. Georgiana was also aware of how pleased her parents were at the interest William showed in their eldest daughter. And ever eager to please, she was willing to marry him if it would make them happy. Her mother Margaret had reservations about Georgiana's age, but her daughter had convinced herself so much that she was in love with a man she barely knew that the Spencers were sure they were simply helping to arrange a love match. By the spring of 1774, the marriage was agreed upon. On the 7th of June 1774, the day of her 17th birthday, Georgiana was married to William at Wimbledon Parish Church. It was a small ceremony, with only her parents, her paternal grandmother, and 2 of her soon-to-be siblings-in-law. Although their daughter was now married, Georgiana's parents maintained an emotional influence over her through letters. While many of these were filled with love and care, Margaret also sent long letters chastising her daughter for her many apparent faults, blaming herself for not teaching her better before her marriage due to her age. She stated that Georgiana was idle, giddy, and fond of dissipation. Others were more concerned that whenever they met with Georgiana and William, he barely seemed to speak to his new bride, or show her any attention at all, really. It turned out they had little in common, and that William was not interested in fulfilling any emotional needs Georgiana had. It must have been heartbreaking for her after watching her parents' loving relationship to realise she was not going to receive the same, and that her sole purpose was going to be producing a legitimate heir and carrying out her social obligations. She even tried her hardest to fit into the exacting ways of the Cavendish family, who were introverted and self-conscious in public due to being a leading political family for the past few centuries, and spoke with a peculiar drawl which she tried to emulate. At a ball they once both attended, Georgiana grew so overheated from dancing and the tightness of her dress that she fainted. William, seeing a crowd gathering at the other end of the room, inquired what was happening. When told, he simply said, "I thought the noise was amongst the women," and remained where he was, not even bothering to pretend to check on his wife. As at the time it was also considered unfashionable for a husband and wife to spend much time together, William was able to spend his nights away from Georgiana at Brooks, a gentleman's club in London, drinking and playing cards. This appears to not have been an intentional unkindness, but simply that due to his upbringing and an old-fashioned idea that a wife was merely for loyalty and support, meant William simply did not know how to be romantic towards his wife. Once Georgiana realised she had been effectively rejected by her husband for all purposes except breeding, it wasn't long before she sought the emotional connection she craved elsewhere. Fashionable high society was all too happy to embrace her, almost everyone falling in love with her naturalness, her ability to chat happily with several people at once, and her easy way of making everyone feel she had listened to them properly and with interest. However, some also said her behaviour often verged on the hysterical, probably a combination of Georgiana's over-eagerness and her self-conscious awareness of always being on show, leading to her feeling the need to entertain constantly. And when she was nervous, Georgiana also often drank too much, leading to her attempting to show off in front of people. Once, after drinking too much one evening, Georgiana upset many people by pulling the hair feathers out of an older lady's fashionable hairdo and puffing out her cheeks with her friends and popping them. To us, this simply sounds like a young woman being, well, a young woman who was still a teenager, probably over-anxious due to her prominent position in society and making too much of herself as a result. This was only made worse by the constant reprimands from her mother. This pushed Georgiana ever further into distracting herself with frivolities. This included fashion, for which she would become a trendsetter. Women's hair was already arranged high, but she went further by creating a 3-foot-high hairdo using pads of horsehair with her own to create height, decorating the top with ornaments. Another of her creations was to wear a long ostrich feather draped across the front of her hair, something which became a hit overnight with the fashionable set, especially as ostrich feathers were expensive and hard to come by. Within a year, she was a celebrity of the day, and newspapers quickly realised stories about her ramped up their sales. Unfortunately, the more the papers wrote about Georgiana and the more readers devoured stories about her, the more she enjoyed the attention and played up to the papers for those stories. One story reported how the famous Signor Lovatini had come on stage wearing an enormous headdress of red and white flowers in imitation of the one Georgiana had worn on her last visit. Instead of getting annoyed when the crowd laughed at the joke, Georgiana smiled and gave Lovatini a low bow, which earned her cheers of approval from the crowd. People liked a Duchess who was happy to poke fun gently at herself, and it made them feel closer to her. However, this public fame and fashion had its downsides. Before 1774 was out, Georgiana's lifestyle meant she had suffered a miscarriage. Her parents decided that she needed to be away from the excesses of London for a while, and she travelled with them and her husband to Spa again for a short holiday. Her health returned, and on the way home they decided to call into Versailles and say hello to Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. Georgiana was actually already familiar with the French Queen, having met her on previous visits, but it was on this occasion that this blossomed into a full and lasting friendship. Both had married not for love but for social position and connections, and both had overbearing mothers. Georgiana also struck up a friendship with the Duchess de Polignac, one of Marie Antoinette's reckless and entertainment-loving friends. On her return home, Georgiana once again fell pregnant, and for a while it appeared the couple were developing an understanding with each other. Her letters home indicated William was starting to show more interest in her, but they were so unlike one another that it soon fell short. However, Georgiana's lifestyle was so hectic that she once again miscarried in April 1776. And aside from her drinking, Georgiana also developed a liking for gambling. Not surprising, considering she had grown up watching her parents partake in it as part of the family routine. The Duchess was hugely in debt. She had kept this quiet while pregnant, hoping that the birth of an heir would dissuade some of her husband's anger if she told him about the debt after the baby arrived. Unfortunately, not only had she lost her child, but Georgiana now had nothing to console William with. After waiting too long for payment, her creditors threatened to ask the Duke directly for the money, which frightened her into finally telling her parents about her debt, which was close to £3,000. To put that in context, her allowance was £4,000 a year. Her parents were furious with her, only calmed by friends concerned for Georgiana's fragile health. They paid her debts but insisted she tell William everything. When Georgiana told her husband, crying and faltering, he showed no reaction. He paid her parents back the money and never spoke of the matter again. This was far more unnerving for Georgiana than if William had exploded with anger, and for her mother, Margaret was shocked to learn her daughter was capable of hiding things from her. She wrote to her daughter urging her to only carry as much money as she was prepared to lose, and to write to her each day, honestly admitting how much she had won or lost at cards. It was clear Margaret was losing her influence and control over her daughter. By 1777, however, Georgiana was once again making friends. This time it was with a young woman named Mary Graham. While in Brighton in October taking the sea air, Georgiana met Mary and the Duchess was immediately taken with her. Mary was quiet, reserved and gentle, but she was also extremely beautiful, which is possibly how Georgiana noticed her. The pair's friendship was intense, and they exchanged letters to the exclusion of almost all others, leaving Margaret to complain that Georgiana's letters had slowed to almost nothing to her. However, Mary was also seen as a good influence, and it was helpful for Georgiana to have someone genuine to talk to about her problems. It seems the passion of their relationship was so much that the pair were concerned they would be gossiped about, and many of the Duchess's letters show she worried over what to put in a letter to her friend that might be read by the maids. We will never really know if Georgiana's feelings for her friend went beyond the platonic. Her friendships in France had influenced her with their public displays of affection and flirting between female friends, and so all her relationships appeared this way. In 1776, the American colonies broke away from Britain, and by 1778, France had entered the war as an ally of the Americans. As Lord Lieutenant of Derbyshire, or Lieutenant in British English, William was expected to arrange a voluntary militia in case of French invasion. While most able-bodied men were already in the army, this didn't stop the aristocrats. The Duke travelled to a camp near London to Coxheath in Kent, and Georgiana went with him. At first, she was seen as a novelty, and the soldiers were happy to see her walking behind her husband as he inspected the troops. Although a large house was arranged for her, the Duchess managed to persuade her husband to allow her to live in the camp with him in a set of ostentatious marquee tents decorated with rugs and silverware, which, considering most of the camp lacked sanitation and was very basic, probably didn't go down too well. The soldiers were not so happy seeing her after a few months, and her presence was no longer tolerated by William, so Georgiana instead went to play cards and have picnics with her equally bored friends staying at the camp with their husbands. It wasn't long before Georgiana, with typical energy, realised that although women were not allowed to join in fighting, there was nothing preventing them creating a female auxiliary corps. She designed a smart uniform of a masculine coat over a close-fitting dress and paraded with the other aristocratic ladies at Coxheath. Although it would seem they simply dressed up and played at being soldiers for a while, it was more important than that. Georgiana had broken with tradition, and for the first time, aristocratic women organised themselves as a voluntary military group able to assist their husbands. However, she soon lost her taste for her parades when she discovered her husband and one of the other noble ladies had been meeting each other secretly while Georgiana marched through the camp. The affair finally came to an end when Georgiana's parents told the lady in question it was over and informed the Duke how disgusted they were with him. But her husband's infidelity was even worse than this. Before Georgiana had married William, he had an affair with a milliner's daughter named Charlotte Spencer, no relation. Their relationship had birthed a daughter named Charlotte Williams, something which Georgiana had no idea about. In 1781, Charlotte Spencer died, leaving the young girl without a mother at around 7 years old. For the early part of her life, little Charlotte had financially been taken care of by her father, but now she was taken into his household. Considering Georgiana had not known about the child or her husband's earlier affair, her response to being told the child would now be raised in their household was graceful and kind. She immediately took the little girl to heart. Considering she had yet to have any children of her own, she lavished her maternal feelings on Charlotte, raising her as her own daughter even after the birth of her biological children. Her mother, Margaret, was not pleased at this new addition to the family, but Georgiana responded that Charlotte was the best humoured little thing you ever saw. In the summer of 1782, Georgiana and William went to Bath to take the waters, and it was here that the Duchess would make a fateful acquaintance, Lady Elizabeth Foster. William was there to cure his gout, and Georgiana to cure her apparent infertility, as the previous year she had suffered yet 2 more miscarriages. They had met Elizabeth, or Bess as Georgiana would come to call her, in their first week in Bath. Elizabeth was separated from her husband and 2 sons, and she and her sister, who was also separated from her husband, lived with a maiden aunt. They were basically destitute, but Georgiana immediately found them interesting company in the dullness of Bath and its company of ill people coming for medicinal treatment. Elizabeth was the opposite of Georgiana in looks. Georgiana was tall and striking, fashionable but not classically beautiful, with strawberry blonde hair and a firm chin. Elizabeth was short, slim, delicate, and had an air of feminine helplessness about her, with wispy, dark hair framing her face. Her marriage to John Foster, a member of the Irish Parliament, was initially happy. Her father had merely been a bishop, only inheriting the title Earl of Bristol after both his elder brothers died childless, and at the time her marriage had been seen as a great advantage for her. But after seducing his wife's maid, Foster had told Elizabeth to give him their children, one of them as soon as they were weaned, as she had only just given birth to one of them a few months before, and that he would not be paying her a penny of support. While mothers at the time had no legal rights over their children, it was not legal to leave a wife with no income in the case of a separation. The fact it happened suggests either her parents overlooked this in the marriage contract, or Foster had some proof his wife had been unfaithful to him and threatened her with divorce. To make this worse, her skinflint father was reluctant to support his daughter despite having the income for it, leaving her on just £300 a year and often forgetting to give her an allowance on time at all. It left her stuck in a position where her title would not allow her to have a respectable position such as a governess, and also not have any other means of independent income. Elizabeth could see that both Georgiana and William were lonely, albeit in different ways, and she saw immediately a place where she could be a companion to them both while improving her own situation. Lord and Lady Spencer were horrified when they discovered that not only their daughter but also her husband had fallen under the spell of Elizabeth. Everyone but Georgiana and William seemed able to see straight through Lady Foster, and for the rest of the summer they shared their time together, reading Shakespeare to each other in the evenings. It was during this time that Elizabeth and William started their affair. By autumn, Elizabeth returned with the couple to Devonshire House. She developed a bad cough and Georgiana complained about it. But worse than that was the fact William seemed concerned for Elizabeth's health as well. For the first time since meeting her new friend, the Duchess felt jealous of her husband's sudden devotion to Elizabeth, and she herself suddenly felt ill, which in turn brought Lady Foster's attention back to herself. But it was no good, and Georgiana now seemed to spot some of the red flags about her new special friend. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and the Duke spent more time together, even when visiting Georgiana's family, choosing to go out riding together, alone, until supper. But equally, she lavished time and attention on Georgiana, ensuring her comfort and happiness whenever William wasn't present. Soon after, in late 1782, Georgiana had once again fallen pregnant, but unlike the times before, she was in much better health. Elizabeth left in December for France, accompanied by young Charlotte. William had decided his illegitimate daughter would now have Lady Foster as a governess, and that the warmer air of France would cure Elizabeth's cough. But letters from Georgiana to Elizabeth reveal she hoped her friend would return to live near her husband and herself, but what is also made clear is that she could not stomach the idea of them having an affair. On the 12th of July 1783, Georgiana finally gave birth to her first much longed for child, although it was not the heir William had hoped for. Instead, their eldest child was a daughter named Lady Georgiana Dorothy Cavendish. A touching letter from Georgiana to Elizabeth talks about her fears at the moment her child came into the world, that they were dead as they hadn't moved or cried. Then, when the little girl was laid next to her, she finally took a breath and cried, and Georgiana burst into hysterical tears, along with her mother and the Duchess of Portland, who were both with her. It shows the emotion Georgiana felt behind the birth of her little daughter. For her, it was not merely about creating an heir. She nicknamed her new daughter Little G. In a break with aristocratic tradition, Georgiana also chose to breastfeed her daughter herself. William's family were annoyed at this, wanting her to employ a wet nurse and get on with carrying the son her husband wanted, but she refused solidly. Public opinion of what she chose to do was met with applause, lauding her decision as a member of the nobility to remain close to her child. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was travelling around Italy with her charge, having several sexual affairs along the way with different members of European nobility. In July 1784, it was finally time for Elizabeth to return from Italy, although she left Charlotte at school in Paris, where she would remain until the outbreak of the French Revolution. This time around, as much as Georgiana wanted Elizabeth near her, she was also a lot more suspicious of her. Not surprising, considering the affair between Elizabeth and William once again restarted, and it wasn't long after that the Duke had not only got his wife pregnant, but his lover as well. Not long after, Elizabeth once again returned reluctantly to France after doctors recommended she return to a warmer climate for her delicate health, and also, probably, to hide her imminent pregnancy. Once again, the Duchess was bereft, and unable to party while she was once again pregnant, Georgiana returned to her gambling habit, racking up enormous debts of thousands of pounds. On the 29th of August 1785, Georgiana gave birth to her second child, another daughter named Lady Harriet Elizabeth Cavendish, nicknamed Harrio for short. Meanwhile, now in Italy, Elizabeth had also given birth in secret to the Duke's other child, a daughter named Caroline Rosalie. She had to stay in unknown inns along the way to avoid gossip, a trusted family servant of her brother's travelling with her, pretending to be her husband. Elizabeth would finally return home a year later, settling in once again with the Cavendish couple, although now there would be some changes. It became obvious to Georgiana the sexual and romantic entanglement between her best friend and her husband, but equally, her own strong feelings towards Elizabeth seem to have not waned. To this day, there is discussion over how strong those feelings really were, but whatever the case, a strange ménage à trois was arranged between the three of them in private. High society was scandalized by their living arrangements and gossip prevailed. But while Georgiana once again felt the loneliness of no romantic partner for herself, she was prevented by convention from taking a lover until she gave birth to an heir. Her time finally came on the 21st of May 1790 when the Duchess finally brought a son into the world. He was named William George Spencer Cavendish and he was given the title of Marquis of Hartington at birth. At long last, with the birth of her son, Georgiana was free to take a lover for herself and begin a new chapter of her life, provided she kept away from scandal. While she had begun as a flighty and overeager young girl, the Duchess had now matured and understood that if she wanted the affection she so desperately needed, she would need to look elsewhere for it. And she would find it in the arms of a man who wasn't her husband, but she wouldn't succeed in avoiding scandal.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.